coming along, everyone. Welcome to the Graveyard Shift. Thanks for spending your time with me this afternoon. I'm a distinguished engineer at Solace. So at Solace, we make an event streaming distribution platform. My job's a distinguished engineer, so I help people like yourselves understand how some of this EDA magic can apply to your business use cases, right? So we're talking about building event-driven apps at scale here. So today, probably I'm guessing the feeling that you've kind of been talking a lot about the kind of detailed technical level, right? I saw a presentation on how to scale out lambdas, for instance. I'm going to change the focus a bit and talk about scaling from that more kind of organizational point of view, okay? Because when we're doing architecture, we have to think about the detailed technical implementation. Like Gregor mentioned, you have to go down into the details, right? But we can't neglect that organizational point of view and some of the characteristics of that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. Right, as mentioned, please ask questions through the app. All right, so just in way of agenda, first two, I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on them, right? I'm kind of hoping that by now we kind of know what events are and what we're doing them. Hands up, yes? Yeah, good, right, okay, good. So good, I've truncated that part of the presentation, good. Just go through with a bit of history to give us some context as to where we are, because that's quite important for kind of setting the context for kind of products. It's probably not something you've heard much about. When we talk about events as products, how's that going to work? And that's kind of leading into, warning, a little bit of a vendor pitch, but how we in Solace see that we can create this idea of event API products and how that affects how you might glue your applications and your organization together. Okay? All right. Let's move on. Okay, so going to skip this slide, right? It's basically there to remind us all, you know, Gregor talked about this, right? We want to do event-driven because it gives us that agility angle, okay? We talked about decoupling and the degree of decoupling you need. I'm going to take this up to kind of the enterprise level, right? What do we need to do about decoupling at the enterprise level, and how do we solve some of the challenges associated with that? All right. Just an example of some of the use cases that we can see and some of the effects that some of this event-driven architecture can kind of give us. This is actually a customer of mine, Unilever. And what they did is they looked at their supply chains during the pandemic. Okay, so we've had talks about online stores and things like that. Supply chain aspect here, a very simple question. What happens to the containers that are shipping things like shampoo around the world when all of a sudden you no longer need those little tiny bottles that you're going to put in a hotel because hotels are shut because it's a pandemic, and all of a sudden you need to make more bigger bottles that you're going to ship to supermarkets, right? What actually happens is you end up with a load of containers sitting on a dock somewhere waiting for their production run to be rescheduled or waiting for somebody to decide what to do with all those little plastic bottles that haven't been filled with shampoo yet. Now the problem with that is that the docks don't like that, because they're not a container park. And the shipping companies don't like that because they get paid for moving stuff around. So they charge you these things called detention and demurrage charges. And it turns out that Unilever was spending an awful lot in the multiple millions of euros a year on these charges. So how are you going to fix that? Well, you need visibility, right? You need to be able to track and monitor what's going on with your production jobs and the containers and the ships and all the other associated bits in the supply chain. Obviously, you're bringing in data from multiple third parties, so you're hooking into SaaS services, for instance, that are doing your IoT-style tracking for you. So the problem there is that, you know, doing a kind of overnight batch run, that doesn't really cut it, because you need to be able to react to this stuff much quicker. You need to be able to see dashboarding-style alerts as things happen. So if there's a storm somewhere, for instance, that's going to delay a shipment, you need to know where that is. And that's where Unilever found this was their pilot use case in deploying an event-driven architecture. Can we bring this shipping information, something like 1,500 shipments on the move at any one time, how can we bring that into a single dashboard so that you've got kind of a management insight into it? And that's what they did. But then something interesting happened. Anybody remember this? Yeah. You can imagine if you're trying to ship raw materials like, let's say, vanilla pods for ice cream, this is a massive problem because you've got your refrigerated containers full of vanilla pods, which are worth, a container can be worth multiple millions of vanilla pods. They're incredibly expensive things. And it's sitting at the mouth of the Suez Canal, and you've got to make a decision as to what do you do. So do you move it round the Horn of Africa? Do you take that 3-week delay because you don't know how long that delay is going to be? So you need to do some kind of modeling, right? You need to look at the variability and what can happen here and decide upon the impact. And that's where you bring in the whole kind of digital twin idea. You start simulating and working out, well, okay, should I wait 3 days and make a decision, or should I make the decision now, or should I just sit it out? And that was a kind of side unexpected benefit of deploying this event-driven architecture, because it enabled them to do this kind of what-if analysis using this whole kind of digital twin idea. Something Gregor mentioned was the idea of this decoupling given this fast and flexible response to things. So in this case, it's bringing on extra services to enable us to do this kind of simulation, right? So a real-life use case there for you. Okay, all right. Another kind of aspect, when people say to me, why should I do event-driven? This is usually the classic example I like to give. Anybody been in this situation? Anybody, right? It's a nice illustration, right? Your upset child in the back is saying, how many more miles? And he's like, we're nearly there, we're nearly there, we're nearly there, right? But it illustrates a serious point. And that serious point is that if you're constantly asking an API for an update to find out if something's changed, that's really inefficient. That's a good example of when you might want to consider doing event-driven, right? And Gregor mentioned, you've got this idea of starting off, you might just have a notification event. You might then phase in event carried state transfer, right? You can do this in a gradual process, and this is one of those kind of cases where you might want to start. Okay. All right, so just to illustrate how serious this is, anybody got SAP in their organization? I'm disappointed by how few, actually. I was expecting a lot more for that. Normally you say that and everybody goes, oh yeah, we've got... Right, so SAP is becoming event-driven, okay? If you look at HANA and their BTP platform now, they've got an event catalog where you can go in and see all of the events that have changed. So, for instance, has your production order had an update? And it will send you a notification to say this production order has been updated. And actually, if you look at behind this, quick vendor plug, if you want to know how SAP have done this, they've used Solace to do this. Right? All right, so does everybody think we should be using events somewhere? Yes? Yay! So 3 of us then, great, okay. All right. So where are we with events then? Like, what's the state of play? And as I say, the reason here is to set some context for what I'm going to be talking about later. So I like this as an example. It's kind of a rough timeline of how we've been communicating between applications, right? Or even in applications. And I like the way we've got GOTO on here, right? So, functions, procedures, RPC, and then we start getting a bit more serious about this. We start moving into the kind of ESB era. We talk about SOA, which has its own problems because you've got a single choke point. Then you talk about messaging. Then you move into the API space. Okay, so question we might want to think about is, when we start talking about events and streamings, do they replace APIs? Are they kind of orthogonal to APIs? Do they suit the same purpose? Well, yeah, and I'll give you an example. But then we move into this event streaming space. We talk about event processing. And what I'm going to talk about is how we kind of elevate this event streaming space up to gluing organizations together. And how we're going to do that is moving some of the kind of goodness that you're probably all used to in the REST API space into the event space, right? Okay. So let's have a little look at the landscape. So, all right. So all of us can probably deal with the idea of events at a local level, right? Has anybody ever done any GUI programming? Right, you probably... There's one person who's lying, I know. So we're used to the idea of event loop, right? You don't say, has the button been pushed? Has the button been pushed? Has the button been pushed? You push the button, something happens. Okay, so if you're using Go, right, you're talking about event-driven as a language. If you talk about the distributed space, actually, if you think about it, there's some really quite REST-friendly technologies there. You've got things like WebSockets, you've even got webhooks. And if you think about webhooks, that's actually quite a nice way of doing event-driven in the REST world. Like, the simplest case of that might be a webhook that invokes a Lambda. And that's actually quite a nice way of bringing a kind of event-driven processing into probably a more REST-driven world. But then we can move on and we can talk about event streaming. So that graph there has come out a little bit small, but that's there to represent market data. If anybody's old enough to remember the Big Bang in the city in 1986, right, that brought a lot of this whole market data idea. Market data, if you think about it, is probably one of the first really widespread cases of event-driven architecture. Because in market data, you don't send, here's all the prices in one chunk, you send out price updates. It's an excellent example of event-driven architectures. Some of the things that might enable event-driven architectures, you've got things like messaging systems, ZeroMQ, RabbitMQ, that kind of thing. Solace is part of that kind of space in part of our platform. Obviously, you've got the AWS products there. So if you move, now, notice here I'm talking about streaming as separate from stream processing, okay? So some people like to kind of conflate the two. I see them as different parts of the stack in just the same way that if you're talking about an ESB, you talk about the orchestration and transformation layers as being separate from the transport layer. I think we should keep that distinction in the event space. But you've got event processing, so I know this is an AWS summit, but I'm trying to kind of broaden the conversation here. Obviously, you've got things like Kinesis and stuff like that. But there's some other applications out there, things like stream sets and stream. And you've got some applications that kind of blur the two. So anybody here use Kafka? Okay. There's more people lying up the back there. Okay, are you using stream processing in Kafka? As an example, hands up. Okay, quite a few hands up. Right, okay. All right. So then you're more into the event sourcing space. We've had some conversations about Lambda and how that can be used with, say, EventBridge to do event sourcing. There's also an open source tool called Event Store, which is more a kind of combined event sourcing database kind of tool too. Now, interesting one here. Market data, who's Red Flash boys or you know, all that kind of stuff, right? All about low latency. We've actually got a customer that has moved their trading system into AWS. Super low latency stuff. Quite an interesting project. Lesson from that project, get your AWS AE involved. It turns out that there's a lot you can do in AWS that might not be immediately obvious to you, right? And they were able to achieve quite significant latency savings by doing that. Anyway, okay, so here's where we are, but here's some of the problems. Have you noticed in every one of these vendor presentations, there's always a rain on the parade slide? Right, that's what that picture is there. That's the parade being rained on. Okay, some interesting quotes here for you. Here's a blog article I really like. I'm going to read it out because it's so good. Event sourcing, a bag filled with mines designed to blow your legs off and leave you to a crippled life filled with pain. So somebody doesn't like event sourcing. It's actually a very good article because, just as in Greg's talk, you know, we're architects here, we have to understand how to apply this. Event sourcing is really, really hard. It is really hard to design, it's really hard to operate. It does have some massive advantages, but you need to know what they are and when to use them. That's not the subject of my talk. Okay, here's another great blog post that talks about disadvantages and advantages of event-driven architecture. I'm not going to go through them one by one, right? But you know, error handling is a good one that's a problem. Okay. Finding out what's happened. Where's my event gone? Who got it? Right? Wouldn't it be nice if we had some kind of debug in there where we could trace events throughout all of the different stages in its lifetime? Quick plug there. Talk to me afterwards if you want to know more about that. Okay. All right. So the result of this, I've tended to notice, and I'd be interested to kind of find out how many people agree with this, is that you tend to end up with lots of islands of event-driven applications. So one of the classic examples is that everybody has their own autonomous event-driven use case, And nobody really thinks about how we're going to use this at the enterprise level. How are we going to glue all of this together across an organization, right? Because, for instance, there might be one island that really needs to see the gold in the other island, the treasure in the other island. There might be another island that really needs to see the pearls of wisdom in a different island. If you notice from the Tolly's Cinch talk, you had the individual components that were very much, domain-driven, that's great, but there was no real sense there of how we're going to share information at an organizational level, right? And we've seen that this is really a challenge. Now, we're at AWS here. Obviously, sometimes people work in multiple geographies. How are we going to share these events across geographies? Little bit of shock horror here. Some people are multi-cloud, right? Some people are hybrid cloud, right? How do we share this event information between those different environments? Okay, another aspect of this that we've seen, especially for those of you using something like Kafka, is operational complexity, right? We've talked a lot about this idea of autonomy. So if you're in an individual domain and you're only considering your own domain events, it's not too much of a problem, right? You can scope that nicely. But if we start moving that up to the organizational level, it becomes a bit more of a challenge because we can't say how many consumers we're going to have of those events. That's not impossible to do in something like Kafka, but it is an operational challenge. What that means, though, is that while you're doing that, you're going to have to start talking to other team members and how they're operating their local cluster, for instance. And that is starting to inhibit our autonomy, right? We don't want to necessarily have to schedule ourselves into other teams' operational schedules to get the use case that we want. So one of the things this does is gives us autonomy inside domains, but not necessarily between domains. So again, we're kind of inhibiting that kind of how we bring the value of events up to an enterprise level. All right, so what do we need? Well, we need to be able to balance this autonomy. Okay, so, we've got this idea of event distribution within a domain, and we're going to have to kind of do a little bit of governance around that. If we're going to start talking about distributing events across the whole enterprise, we're going to have to start thinking more seriously about the governance around that. How are we going to document this? How are we going to ensure that only the right people can access these events, for instance, if they've got personal identifiable information in them? How are we going to promote and demote the events between these two? I've only mentioned two, local and global. There could be multiple levels. There could be within a domain, a kind of global level of the domain. There could be between limited domains, and there could be right up to the enterprise level. There could be multiple stratifications here. Obviously, we talk about standardization is an easy way of making things available everywhere, right? So we're quite lucky here. We're getting people who are working on this space. There's async API, which is more kind of the interface side of things, and then there's cloud events, which is more around the metadata. And then tooling. So one of the things that was quite interesting for me around Tolly's talk from Cinch was around how do we tool it, how do we describe our events, how do we catalog them? How do we share these interfaces between disparate teams? Okay, one last point here, API-driven design, okay? This is an interesting slide from from a similar event to this one called EDA Summit. This is another Solace customer, Roche, and how they see this space developing. So, like us, we had Gregor talking about the idea that you need to apply the right thing in the right place. So will event-driven replace APIs? No, they're complementary to each other. APIs give the ability to compose applications from the bottom up. And that's the kind of north-south arrow there. What event-driven does is give you that kind of east-west capability, that way of kind of talking between different applications, right? And this is Roche's view of it. So you can see all kinds of stuff here. We've got SAP on there. We've got things like clinical research and things like that. But there's a problem here. We've got lots of lovely tooling at the API level. We don't at the event level, do we, really? Tolly talked about Axway, but that's still very API-driven. All right, so where I'm kind of leading to this is if we look at our event landscape picture, I've talked about this idea of kind of we're ending up with these event-driven islands. One of the ways we can break down that is focusing on this area here. How are we going to enable the distribution of events across the enterprise rather than within a domain? So, if only there was somewhere we could look to get a model for how we might do this. Well, it turns out there is. I'm sure most of us here probably have used REST APIs, API products, API developer portals. They've got a very good view of how to do this. They've got this thing called API products. And what that is a way of gathering together a bunch of APIs and delivering them as a single unit, as a product, right? So, I don't know if anybody here is a fan of Gartner, but they've got this composable enterprise idea. One of the points with this, I talked about the organizational point of this, is that if you think about an individual API, that's probably managed by us in the technical community. But if we move to this product mindset, it gets a bit different, doesn't it? Because we have more lifecycle concerns. Hopefully, if it's a product, we're going to be wanting to be kind of monetizing it, maybe even. So we need a product manager for this. We need someone who's going to make sure that documentation's up to date. We're going to make sure that someone who's looking after the life cycle of this product. So it's a slightly different, although it's composed of the same kind of technical aspects, it needs a bit of a different mindset in looking after this. Okay, all right, so we've got this idea of API products. Have we got event-driven APIs? Well, it turns out we do. We can do this. So I mentioned async API, and that's a great way of creating an event-driven API, right? It gives you a standard way of saying, here is a way to access this particular event. So why don't we elevate that then and say, why don't we create event API products rather than REST API products as a product? If you think about how that might be composed, don't we all love the e-commerce applications? So here's an example. So we've got an order management system, right? That's probably got a REST front end, right? Somebody's going to request an order and get a response back. But at the back end, we're probably producing events, right? So order received, order processed, order shipped, that kind of thing. So that's what our order management system is responsible for everything. Then we might have a warehouse management system. Again, this might be a SaaS, for instance. We might have some events out of that. So stock's been allocated or a product has become available. We might have a product catalog, and then we might have some ready to sell events associated with that. And let's imagine our marketing team might be wanting to launch some promotions, okay? So we've got this kind of list of disparate events here, and we could produce them as event APIs, as single kind of events. But if we think about the applications that might want to consume these, let's imagine we're FedEx or DPD or somebody like that. There's probably a bunch of events that we want. We probably want to start scheduling deliveries as a customer is placing an order, and then when the order's actually ready for shipment, we probably want to know about that. If there's a problem with stock, we're probably interested in that too. So we're using multiple events there. So you're starting to build up the idea that actually we probably want to ship these events as a single unit that FedEx or DHL or whatever are going to consume. And we can build this up. Maybe we've got some kind of inventory management application. Now notice here that our stock allocated event is being used in multiple places. That's good, right? But if you think about it from how we're going to ship this out to customers who are going to consume these, that means that we need to think about stock allocated in a bit more because it's impacting multiple downstream systems. And you can say the same, maybe we want to update price comparison tools when there's a promotion launched, but if the product isn't ready to sell yet, we probably need to know about that. So we've got multiple events being used by single consumers, and by consumers I mean something that's consuming them rather than an event consumer. And we've got multiple events being used by multiple kind of business functions. So the idea really is to take these business functions, bundle them up, the events that go to make that business function, and think about it from a kind of more business point of view, right? The point with this, then, is that we need to think about these things as a product in itself. So we need a product manager. We need to lifecycle manage it. We need to think about the governance effects of this, so who is able to access this product. We need to lifecycle manage it. We've probably got a product manager for it. So in this particular case, we might create an order status product, right? And that's great, because it turns out with Async API, we can bundle all this up and ship it as a single definition for that product. Life is good. And we can think about some other products that we could ship too. We might have an inventory product, for instance, and we might have a product pricing product that we're going to ship. It's going to go to our, compare the market if it's financial or that kind of application. All right, so if we think about this, actually, if we go back to the previous slide here, we're using multiple events in multiple products. So if we think about this from kind of a tiered view, this, again, comes from the REST API world, right? You've got, if you talk to MuleSoft, for instance, they'll talk about you having system APIs, which are technical APIs, which expose a given technical function. Now, some of these, it turns out, are probably going to be higher value, right? So some of our order events, quite important, because our shipper might want to know about them. Logging in event, it's totally essential. You can't operate the system without it, but it's probably not going to be useful at an enterprise level, right? And then, of course, we can bundle them together then. Once we know which are the enterprise events, which ones have got the highest value, we can bundle them together in our products, because obviously there isn't much point in bundling low-value events into a product, right? We want to create value here. All right, now, last piece of the puzzle, we need to be able to expose these, right? We need a way of showing these to our potential users so that they can evaluate their use and their value. So you can see you've got this kind of tiered structure here of increasing value as you go up. And kind of the top piece of value here is how we expose them to our potential developers, our developer portal. Now, of course, in the REST API world, this is well understood, and you've got the REST API portals, right? We're probably all familiar with them. Okay, well, how are we going to do this in the event world? All right, well, kind of the first thing we need to do is we need to know what events we've got available to us. So some kind of discovery mechanism might be good. We could import them from a documentation set, but we don't necessarily know whether that documentation set is complete. So some way of being able to import them from the runtime would be nice. Obviously, that gives us, we can now start looking at that bottom tier and assessing which ones need to be raised up to the enterprise level, and that's when we can start thinking about how we're going to bundle them together, right? But this is where the documentation starts coming in. Remember, we're thinking about this as a single product. So the documentation for an individual event is not going to be useful here. We have to create documentation for this as a product. Once we've done that, of course, now comes the exciting part. Now comes beer o'clock, right? We're going to expose them to consumers. How are we going to do that? We can have a release schedule, but how are we going to allow users to access them? And then last, of course, and the one that people almost always forget, is we're not done once we've released it, of course. We need to evolve these events. Your architecture is going to be changing underneath. It may be that your event API product is actually going to subtly change function over time. We need to optimize them. We need to create a maximum, if we're monetizing them, we need to maximize how much we can monetize them. Right? And of course, the key thing here is we need to be able to do this quickly. Going into an Excel spreadsheet and pulling out events and deciding which ones are the ones you want to expose at high level, and then putting something together in a Confluence page, that probably is going to slow us down a bit. All right, how are we going to solve this? Alert, I'm into a product pitch now. Okay, so in Solace, we have something called the event portal. It's modeled on our REST API developer portals, so it should be fairly familiar, and we're taking the same kind of approach. One of the things we can do with Event Portal is this idea of discovery, right? So we can probe into obviously the Solace event broker, but we can probe into, say, Kafka or your MSK cluster to find out what events you have defined in that cluster. We can even interrogate the schema registry to find out what your schemas are for your events. We can then bring them into the portal and start looking at those events. So this here is our application view. So what we've done is we've taken these, we've gone from e-commerce to an Uber Lite application. Oh, there you go. Okay, so we can take these events and start thinking about how do they actually move around? What applications do they interact with? And all we've had to do there really is probe into our runtime, find what events are moving around, and just start allocating them to, for instance, if you use the Kafka World consumer groups or applications in the Solace world. Okay, so, all we have to do is download and run an agent, upload them into the portal, and start associating them with applications. And that gives us the ability to start visualizing our event flows. Now, this is quite useful. Do you remember we went back to the idea of actually event-driven is quite hard, and there's no real way of easily visualizing what's going on? That's the idea behind that. Now, of course, in order to do this, once we've got our events there, we need an event catalog. So I notice, people have talked about Backstage. This is our event catalog, and of course, this is the point at which we can start looking into our events and start seeing where are the high-value enterprise events, right? Okay. Also, when we go in here, we can start adding metadata to these events, so we can say who's the owner of the event. One of the things that I've found quite interesting about the presentations I've seen so far is nobody's really talked about the ownership of events. In Solace, we have a view that actually it's probably the producer that owns the event, because producer's the one producing it, right? That's the single point at which you can definitely say there's some responsibility there. So how is that producer going to add that information that I am the owner of this event? I as a person rather than an application. So there's a piece of metadata you can add. There's versioning in there and things like adding documentation, stuff like that. Okay, so we go in our catalog and we can go and start selecting our events to add to our product. Important thing people tend to forget is we talk about this idea of consuming a product. In the event-driven world, it's not like an API, right? If you're producing an API product, here is an API that you're going to call. It's a pretty simple contract. It's not the same in the event-driven world. So if we look back at our delivery provider example, obviously, there's an order that you're going to want to deliver. That's the delivery provider is going to receive that event. But if we're really creating a product, the delivery driver is probably going to want to update back to say, I've received this package. I'm an hour away from the customer. I've delivered it to the customer. Because that's where the real value is. So we need a way of saying in our event API products that, hey, is this something we're going to send to you, or is this something we're expecting from you? And that's something people often forget. Okay, so we're going to select which events we want, decide which direction they go in, and go into the release phase. So again, async API, that's what we're going to use. We're not just going to send files around, because, hey, who does that anymore? So we're going to give you an API, or we'll actually host that for you, so you can just pick up the async API spec. Okay, so the point here I'm hoping we're getting is that we've got these, we've got this idea of event API product, and kind of the point of what I'm showing here is a way of bringing these events into a single place where you can start putting these products together quite easily. Okay, so I'm going to skip on to the next slide. Events and EDA have the potential to create huge value. I think we've all agreed on that. That's why we're here. But events are difficult, right? If anybody doesn't believe this, well, go back to some of those quotes, but try it out for yourself. So the problem with this is that we often end up with these event-driven islands, right? These little kind of scattered implementations of events. The classic thing that happens is that somebody does a pilot project. It all goes well, everybody's happy, and then the team goes on to the next project and implements that. But then there's, it's going so well that they want to do another project, so the team gets split in two, and new people are brought on board, and all that knowledge gets diluted and not shared, and then that's one of the ways that we end up with these event-driven islands. So we need ways to standardize how we're going to exchange these events. A classic example of that is some kind of schema registry, right? So we can understand what's in the event itself. But we also need a way of standardizing how do I get access to the event? What's the interface? Stuff that gets forgotten is we need a way of governing these events too. How are we going to decide who can access a given event? And we need a way to manage them. How are we going to document this event? How are we going to share that documentation? How are we going to communicate about what this event is and where it should be used? And it turns out, aren't we lucky, the REST API industry have seen these problems before in the last decade, and they've kind of solved them. And that's what we're trying to do at Solace, is kind of bring that same idea to these event-driven APIs. And we think tooling is the best way of doing this, because the tooling is going to bring you to a point where you can do things like automation. That's all I wanted to say. Please remember to rate the session. I would love your questions. I love questions. I'll leave some personal details up there. Feel free to come talk to me on the Solace stand along with some of my colleagues. There's my LinkedIn up there. All right. Thanks very much.